The soldier was hiding behind the tree, the rifle aimed at him. His fate could be surrender or death. These were hard times when a village became the stage for a bloody struggle between the salvation of surrounded soldiers and the orders for a swift domination. The fighting spread violently through the trenches. Kadu, sometimes houses were surrounded by gunfire and grenades. Drones flew over the surrounded opponents. In the midst of smoke and death, Kadu, a lieutenant, tried to motivate his group of former inmates. Meanwhile, on the other side, Kadu, a young man with controversial ideals, was gaining experience. Kadu, in his days with the Special Forces Assault Group. The situation of the Ukrainian soldiers was desperate. The Russian advance toward Toretsk surrounded the men who were defending the quiet village of New York. It was a complete siege, which seemed to leave no chance of escape. Surrender or death were the only alternatives. The number of losses would be too high for the Ukrainians. Those were difficult times. But there was hope for those soldiers, even though the situation was generally difficult for Kiev. The Russians had advanced through large portions of Ukrainian territory, especially in Donetsk. It was a difficult time for Ukraine, having to defend complicated positions like Pokrovsk and Toretsk, areas with few secondary defenses after the fall of Avdiivka at the beginning of the year. One of Ukraine's few advantages in the war at that time was being able to keep Moscow's forces stuck in a failed offensive in Kharkiv and sending its drones to fly against strategic targets in Russia. In August 2024, the main intelligence directorate of Ukraine reported that 15 drones were sent to Rostov, hitting fuel and lubricant warehouses. The fire stood out in the night, but that wasn't the only attack that month. The explosions lit up the night in other parts of the Russian oblast. This time, the Morozovsk air base. The flames rose hundreds of meters into the air. At least one Sukhoi 34, one of the planes that plagued Kiev's troops with fragmentation aviation bombs, was destroyed in the process. But Russia had many Su-34s. They flew over Ukrainian airspace, and the bombs were programmed to glide for more than 70 kilometers. The strikes on Ukrainian positions were a terrifying sight. The narrow strip of houses in New York already provided little protection for the soldiers. The explosion of the bombs had a destruction radius of hundreds of meters, reaching over 200 meters for a fragmentation aviation bomb, 1,500. The successive impacts were enough to turn all of Kiev's forces' protection into rubble. Russian troops walked through the wreckage left by the bombs. Some areas had practically nothing left to lose. The residences were completely destroyed by the number of fragmentation aviation bombs dropped by Moscow's Air Force. Grenades started exploding among the ruins. The smoke signaled where the fighting was heating up. That was no longer just a stroll through the apocalypse. Now it was time for the rifles to get to work. A grenade was thrown into one of the basements. The soldiers only moved after making sure the place was clear. The process had to be slow. As they advanced through the destruction, untouched enemies were an unpleasant source of surprises. No soldier wanted an angry Ukrainian with a rifle aiming at their back. The column of smoke was always a sign on the battlefield. It was hard to find the soldier. You had to stay alert to know where to shoot. Lieutenant Mykola Servolodymyrovich warned his men several times not to let their guard down. He had been at war since the 2022 mobilization. It seemed like he would be there for a long time yet. Since he arrived, the 9th Motorized Rifle Brigade had orders to advance at any cost. The command was judged for this, because there weren't enough experienced people in the brigade to take the position. He made sure to follow orders and sent his men forward. Russia was winning, and victories were demanded by the command. It was hard to maintain morale and discipline among the Storm E and Storm V troops. They were all former inmates or problematic soldiers from other battalions. Some had indefinite contracts, continuously renewed whether they wanted it or not. The main difference between the two is that Storm Z contracts offered a pardon at the end of service, while the Storm V units did not guarantee this benefit, which meant that the convicts could return to prison after completing their duties. Putin had cancelled new Storm Z contracts in 2023, creating only Storm V. The Z units, however, continued in action, sent to intense combat on the front lines. The survivors had empty looks. They had been through so many assaults that they now believed in miracles simply because they were alive, or they had completely lost their faith after witnessing the horrors of war for too long. Everyone in that battalion was a former convict. The Ukrainians like to say that there were only rapists, murderers, and thieves there, even serial killers. Yes, in fact, some of them were like that. Those were the worst ones Mykola had to deal with. Gotnova. But most of the newcomers were simply people who had committed minor crimes, sometimes just theft or drug possession. The offer was to go to war for $2,000 a month or go to prison. The propaganda made many people think that going to war would be a lighter sentence. Over there, reality made them reconsider. There were Ukrainians inside buildings that were continuously bombarded, but also in the trenches, in the green areas where the Russians had set up their positions. The Russian bombardments were too intense for these troops to withstand for long. The explosions destroyed the buildings where the Ukrainians were hiding. The battles inside the trenches were violent. The Russians stepped onto the dug-up earth of the trenches, brandishing their rifles at the cornered Ukrainians. The triggers pulled on both sides filled the ground with heavy ammunition. Some bodies were already lying on the ground. They were the fruits of war, rotting on the ground to be collected in black bags. That is, if they were ever collected. The grenades exploded, covering the fighters' vision. A Ukrainian tried to stop the Russian advance with a PKN machine gun. The Moscow soldier, more alert, managed to hit the weapon. The man from Kiev barely escaped. He managed to retreat with the others. With little ammunition, increasingly cornered, the Ukrainians had few options in New York. Inside the city, death rained down. Fire rained down. The streets and houses were flooded with sadness and despair. The Ukrainians saw their comrades being torn apart by the violent blasts of Russian bombs. The siege was wearing down the troops quickly. Mykola kept pressing his soldiers as he received orders. The artillery shouted deadly insults at the Ukrainians. The lieutenant lost many soldiers in those days in New York, noting with sadness the cost of the victories. It was August 2024 when he learned that the Ukrainians were surrounded, which made the superiors push the assaults even harder.
Command A even declared victory in the
soldiers
capture
from
of New
Kiev
York.
were surrounded for almost 2 weeks. The massacre was about to happen when problems began for Mykola and the 9th Motorized Rifle Brigade. One of the assaults was suddenly interrupted by shots from a tank. The explosion stopped one of the vehicles, smoke pouring from the metal where the broken bodies of the Russian soldiers were buried. The other vehicle managed to escape, but the tank chased after it. The dust marked the tense battle. The shots exploded near the Russian vehicle. After multiple explosions from tank fire and kamikaze drones, the Russian armored vehicle stopped. A soldier fell out of the vehicle, his body covered by smoke. Some pickup trucks were stopped by the same violence. The Russian assault began to lose strength. The men had to get out to continue. Mykola knew who those new soldiers were. The information started to spread through the command. He cursed. The men who escaped the attack on the armored vehicles tried to hide in some houses. The Ukrainian Air Force, although nowhere near as powerful as the Russian one, had some effective weapons. The bomb destroyed an entire building where some soldiers had taken shelter. The tanks of the Ukrainian brigade kept pursuing the soldiers now that there were no more armored vehicles left to destroy. A T-72's cannon could, depending on the ammunition, penetrate up to 500 to 600 millimeters of steel armor. Taking out those light structures was easy. There was enough ammunition for more than 40 shots, depending on the tank model. The targets could be 3 kilometers away, which would still be within the effective range of the T-72. The infantry could be wiped out. With the impact, the lethal radius reached up to 30 meters. Mykola kept receiving more and more bad news. The situation changed in the mid-70s at work. Tool's tank of by his received orders to take part in a special mission to free his compatriots from a Russian siege. He grabbed a rifle and got ready along with the squad. He was proud to be selected for the mission. He didn't even care about the hatred that the name of his brigade brought to the Russians and so many other people. It was a heavy name outside of Ukraine, almost like monsters, but a boogeyman that came to stand up to the invaders sent by Moscow. Artem had been in the 12th Brigade for 2 years, keeping his rifle ready to fire at the invaders. Since he was young, he had been preparing for that, experiencing the bitter fruits of the fight against the Russians. Already at the beginning of his adolescence, he stopped daydreaming when the signal was given. As everyone took their positions, the fight quickly escalated against the Russians in the neighboring houses. The smoke from the firing rifles heated up the air. Grenades flew toward the windows of the enemy shelter as it was a brigade well integrated into modern warfare. Soon they received support from a drone, Baba Yaga. It dropped a heavy explosive on the Russians. Dust and smoke covered the soldiers' vision. The rifles were aimed, waiting for one of the enemies to show themselves. All this in the middle of the suspended dust. One of those grenades released another explosive against the house. The men repositioned themselves to surround the enemies. For sure, their morale had dropped after Baba Yaga's punishment, but they were still dangerous. The soldiers moved through the ruins until they managed to get a safer approach against another enemy position. They almost stepped on the body of one of their dead opponents when they moved to throw a grenade at one of the enemies. The rifles ignited the gunpowder charge inside the cartridges, firing projectiles at the house. Any opening in the wall was a spot where the little lead gifts flew, searching for Russian bodies. The shots went through the windows. The cover allowed the soldiers to throw more grenades at the Russians. The explosion created an eruption of smoke through the window. The attack continued, with more explosives taking up space inside the Russian defenses.
The smoke filled the air inside the house.
The Russians could barely see how many of their own were still alive. The resistance seemed to cease. The Ukrainians slowly entered the middle of the destroyed house. Gradually, they gained confidence. They saw the bodies lying around. The Russians, mutilated by gunfire or deformed by explosions, were everywhere. Artem walked among the dead. A soldier could have many thoughts upon seeing blood drying on bodies disfigured by the damage of combat. Some felt like gods in the valley of death, walking over souls that had challenged them. Others witnessed the fragility of life. Those same Russians who killed and surrounded the Ukrainians were now forgotten corpses in the war zone. Artem was only 20 years old, but since his teenage years, he had been active in Ukrainian political movements. Born in Zaporizhia, where more than half the people spoke Russian, he made a point of showing that it wasn't the language that gave Russia the right to annex the region. That's why he joined the right sector, also known as right sector or private sector. Artem was among them for a long time, trying to get votes in the ultranationalist political movements. Too bad his dream went wrong here. Despite so much activity, they managed to get only one seat in parliament in 2014 and none in 2019. Russian propaganda must have reached them, helping to destroy the private sector's political capital by calling them Nazis, and saying that it was movements like those that dominated Ukrainian politics. The Russians said that the right sector dominated the Kiev regime, even though in reality, they barely managed to get 2% of the votes in the country. Artem thought a lot about this, walking around New York looking for the Russians. He wanted to find those who called him a Nazi and rub some truths right in their faces. They went into dark basements, trying to find the enemies, and the walk through the ruins was exhausting. You had to concentrate and try to hear any noise from the bears amid the explosions and distant gunfire. One of them was alone in one of the basements, surrendered without ammunition or weapons, having they lost everything during the run for survival. He was a BMP driver. He had brought with him 6 Storm Z or 5 soldiers who were now lost as corpses or wandering the ruins of New York. When asked who he was fighting, he replied, after some hesitation, that he was in Ukraine to fight against the Pravi sector.
Not exactly me. What is that? Is there any political information who's against you? They say the sector, Pravi sector, yes?
That almost made the soldiers laugh. In a way, with Artem there, they were now somehow fighting against the Pravi sector. Russian propaganda was strong, making its soldiers believe that this political movement was a formidable enemy, capable of resisting even the second largest military power in the world. The Pravi sector even had a small paramilitary group, but it was disbanded and incorporated into the armed forces. Later, that same brigade was disbanded, accused of benefiting members of the political movement. Artem wouldn't like to admit it, but despite the disproportionate Russian propaganda creating a demon for their holy war, there was also something rotten in the Pravi sector. Several Western newspapers said that the political movement was a far-right group with one foot in fascism. Some had concrete evidence, and there were also serious accusations from the Western media that, yes, there were individuals from the Pravi sector who had associations with neo-Nazi ideals, some even coming from the Israeli media. Die Welt, the New York Times, and Le Monde Diplomatique described some of the constituent groups of Pravi sector as radical right, neo-Nazi or neo-fascist. Artem had never gotten involved in that rotten part. He had his own ideals, and that's why he ended up there in New York with the 12th Special Operations Brigade Azov. Of course, he would be criticized for that. After all, the name Azov was, by itself, a curse among the Russians. One of the reasons for that invasion, Artem went through the initial selection and medical exams. The week of tests was nothing for someone used to sports like him. He was given a month to decide whether he would do the 30-day training program. It didn't take him more than a few hours to decide that he wanted to start right away in 2023. At 19 years old, he already had the codename Bazayev and was working hard to head to the battlefield. Unlike so many Ukrainian brigades, with an absurd shortage of personnel and proper training, the 12th had a big advantage when it came to recruiting and training. The squad from the 12th, the 2nd Brigade, advanced against another trench. They made their way, already shouting for the soldiers to surrender. They were men without ammunition who didn't even dare to throw the only weapon they had left, their grenades. Azov itself didn't have a good reputation, but Artem liked seeing how the prisoners they captured that day were treated. The problem was that some refused to surrender. That made the situation increasingly tense during certain advances on the maps. The rifle was aimed at the man behind the tree. The Ukrainian shouted at the Russian to surrender. He started to turn around, but there was something else in his hands. The trigger unleashed the full fury of the 12th Brigade. The Russian's body fell filled with 5.56 ammunition. Next to him was the automatic Kalashnikov rifle. When the resistance ended, they had to enter a deep shelter to find one more of the Russians. The man claimed to be injured. He received treatment and was taken away with great difficulty. For Artem and the other soldiers, that was very different from the accusations that the Azov battalion received 10 years earlier at the beginning of the Donbass War, when it was still a paramilitary group. There was concrete evidence of war crimes committed at that time. They said that the Azov battalion had changed. Now it was a brigade with such a large and diverse influx of soldiers that it greatly transformed its philosophy. Some even justified it by the fact that the country was under attack from foreign invaders. It was understandable that Ukrainians were not focused on the political opinions of their fellow defenders, but rather on who could do and would fight against the invaders. For others, this justification was rather weak to tolerate certain ideologies that could become an even greater internal risk in a wartime environment. Either way, Russian propaganda took great advantage of this at the time, even though it never managed to realize the fantasy of a Ukraine made up entirely of Nazi maniacs. Now, Artem and so many others were trying to clear that name, fighting fiercely to break that siege, almost hopelessly to save their compatriots. In New York, the 12th Brigade kept receiving the worst missions. Months earlier, they carried out their assault in Avdiivka to allow a desperate retreat of the Ukrainian troops. By the end of the battle, the Russians knew what they were up against. They sent more soldiers to fight the 12th Brigade and saw the enemy movement in the fields. He masked some of his fear with a joking comment filled with propaganda about a Russian army made up entirely of criminals and spies. There was a sea of Russians on the way. On the other side, Mykola and his men from the 9th Motorized Rifle Brigade pushed to retake New York from the enemy, who will manage to put an end to what was almost a guaranteed victory. It was a war between men accusing each other of various crimes. Crimes were committed on all sides, adding to the list of corruption in the conflict. But to make matters worse, men became criminals